When Jan and I were working in the prison system in Florida, and people got Sid's books and tapes, and when I first walked into the first room that we worked in the prison, I have to tell you, I went, there's no way. It was the saddest looking group of people I'd ever seen in my entire life. Most of them couldn't look at you. Some of them were shaking. Some of them were rocking back and forth in their chairs. Some of them were arguing. But all of them looked just god-awful, you know. Now, you also have to remember that in this particular prison, they had 100 people sleeping in one dorm, many of whom had deep psychological problems and were wailing and crying all night. So they were all sleep deprived as well, right? They were all separated from their families. A great number of them had lost their kids to the system, you know. So you can see the depth of that suffering, right? So I look at this and I go, wow, you know, where have we landed? Right? But we put on the tapes. They couldn't take the books back to their cells, but they could read them in the chapel. And they would go and read them in the chapel. And we came back a week later to do the second of a 6-week class we were doing for a group of about 15 people. And I stood at the door and watched them come in. And I wept because so many of them were different people. The way they held themselves, you know, their demeanor, the openness in their faces. This is like 1 week. And when they started to talk, I mean, honestly, Jan and I just went, you talk. Right? Now, in that group of women, in that prison, were 2 or 3 that really, really got hit reading Sid's materials and coming to the class. One in particular, who told a story in this second class of how she woke up in the middle of the night and sat bolt up in her bunk and went, oh my God, it is just thought. I've created this whole world. I've created all this fear that I feel. And this is a person who had been physically and mentally abused all of her life, right? But she saw that in that moment, she was free. She saw that regardless of her experience, regardless of what she'd been through, that her true self, because it was spiritual, had never been touched, had never been damaged. She saw that. And her change was so dramatic that people didn't know what to do with it in that place. Nobody had ever seen anything remotely like that. Not the other inmates, not the corrections officers, you know, not the warden, you know, not even the chaplain. And that change created a profound level of confusion throughout that institution. It did. People were waiting to see it fall apart. Right? People were waiting to see it collapse and see that it was just another blip on the radar screen. But it didn't. And that example brought something to that place that I think had never been seen before. And that was hope. When people saw that somebody could find within them that forgiveness for themselves, that love, that understanding that they had simply created a world with their thinking and that they could live in a whole new world, that their true self had never been damaged, that elevated the level of hope with almost everybody in that institution, including the corrections officers. Right? And what came from that? Curiosity. The next thing we knew, there was a lineup to come. People see this kind of change, the depth and the permanence of it, and it touches them at a very deep level. It was no different in the corporate world when we worked in boardrooms and talked to CEOs and groups of executives. It was always that first 1 or 2 that heard something very deep about their true nature, who and what they were. It was always that change that opened up listening, that opened up change for everybody. Jan and I worked in a large business that was throughout the U.S., and it was in the entertainment business, in the hotel and hospitality and entertainment business. There was a fella that had been in the business, I don't know, 35 or 40 years. He was probably close to retirement. He was a senior executive. And man, he had a hard edge. He just really had a hard edge. In fact, when I met him, I was like, whoa, you know, that feeling you get sometimes when you meet somebody that's, you know. And I really do believe he actually didn't want to come to the retreat we did for management. But he came. And the first day I didn't see anything with him. He just was there. You know. Second day, not much more. But he had to, we were at a golf course, a retreat at this beautiful golf course that the company owned. And he had to go back to the town where he was from for some reason. And was missing for a session, and then he came back. And he walked in, and again, it was a totally different human being, you know. And what had happened was he'd just been listening, not even really attentively, but he and his wife were planning a divorce, right? So he jumps in his car and he drives across southern Louisiana to his little town where he lived. He walks into this little cottage that he was renting while he was starting this job. And he looks at his wife and begins to cry for some reason. And she's like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he says, you know, we need to start over again. It's okay, right? And his marriage is completely changed. And that was from a couple of classes with Sid's videos. And that's all it was. He probably had a total of 3 hours, you know. Now, what was amazing about that is he was the most critical guy I think I'd ever met in a business. He would walk around the business and just give people dressing downs like you would not believe, right? People used to hide when they saw him coming, right? He walks back into the business and he's full of love, and he's walking around telling everybody what a great job they're doing, and, oh, you know, have you ever heard of doing it this way? And just, you know, and like people are like, what the hell's going on? What happened to so-and-so, right? And again, I'm waiting for the penny to drop and for him to go back to his old way, but it didn't happen, you know. And because he was a vice president, because he had so much influence, can you see how there'd be some confusion? Can you see how there'd be some curiosity that would arise from that, right? And so all of a sudden, people are really listening. And they're not listening to fix the business anymore, because the thing that he talked about when he came back to the class was his marriage. He didn't talk about the business. As a matter of fact, the whole last session that we did in that retreat, the business didn't come up, which was kind of odd because we were there to talk about issues they had between parts of the business. But it didn't come up. It just didn't come up. And yet, when those people went back to their business, the way that they saw each other, the way that they interacted was changed so profoundly that the business changed without trying, okay? Without any new programs, any new policies. It just changed. So you see, it's always the same process with the principles. One person has the experience of stopping the world for a moment, of seeing something brand new, and their world changes. Actually, they change. The world changes around them. And that's how this is moving throughout the world. And I'm not knocking all the efforts to, you know, get it into school systems, get it into business. That's all great. But when it comes down to the fact of how change really occurs with this, it occurs because people like you look within yourselves and trust what Sid Banks said about what you have within you. That's where the change comes from. Then all the things you do are blessed with, I'll just be corny, are blessed with a spiritual power. Right? And again, I'm not a religious person. That's not what I'm talking about.